You came in from New Jersey?
New Jersey, yes.
Yeah, right.
Yes, I drove in through Lincoln Tunnel.
Yeah, essentially part of the New York City area.
Yes, yes.
Well, we have a lot to talk about. We have a number of mutual friends, and
yes,
I'm really
absolutely.
pleased you could get here. We got a lot to talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and welcome to MNN, Manhattan Neighborhood Network.
Thank you very much.
And public access.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for having me here.
My pleasure. Yeah. My pleasure. And bear with my ignorance.
That's
right?
no problem.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, welcome very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Dr. Mohammed Ali Chaudry, and he's the president of a very interesting organization headquartered, I guess, in New Jersey we're going to talk about, called Center for Understanding Islam. I can hardly think of something that might be more important for the American citizen to try to focus on at the moment than the charge of your entity. And he's also had a very interesting business career and so forth. And Dr. Chaudry, welcome very much to Conversations.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about.
And to Manhattan Neighborhood Network and public access cable television
to be a part of the
audiences and those that might be watching on a stream around the world. And welcome very much to the program.
Thank you very much.
We got a great deal to talk about. The center is very important, very interesting center for educating people to Islam and so forth. You have Dr. Robert Crane is an associate out there, a well-known figure. But we want to talk about that. But we have a whole hour, right? So I wonder maybe we could personalize this a little bit. Maybe you could share your own background, you know, where you were born and raised, education, and then we can come up and discuss some of the you know, some of the issues that's involved at the Center for Understanding Islam. But could you share a little of your own background, please?
Sure. I grew up in Pakistan, and I left Pakistan in '63.
You were at what age then was that? I mean, how long were you in Pakistan?
I was 21 at that point.
21.
Yes.
I see.
Yes.
And was it Lahore?
In Lahore.
In Lahore.
I grew up actually in a town about 70 miles south of Lahore.
I see.
I went to college in Lahore
and
got involved with the university and in the colleges. And there was an opportunity to go for an international scholarship in Oslo.
I see.
So I went there for a summer.
To Norway, yeah.
Yes, and then decided to visit a friend in London. And at that time I decided to go to the London School of Economics.
All right,
so that's where I got my honors degree in economics.
You got an honors degree
econometrics.
And econometrics?
Yes.
Nathan Klein.
Well, exactly.
Yeah,
Larry
Klein.
Larry Klein.
Larry, yeah.
From Wharton,
yes. So you studied in
England.
In England, having taken an comparable to an undergraduate degree in Lahore?
That's right.
All right, and it was the University of Lahore? Is that a major?
That was the University of Punjab, yes.
Is that the University of Punjab?
Right.
Is that a leading university?
Yeah,
and
that
what
is the largest
university
there
in Pakistan?
In Pakistan. But now there are many other universities that have opened up in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
There are colleges that are associated with the University of Punjab.
Yeah.
So in our province, the University of Punjab is the largest.
And you were studying what? Social sciences?
Economics.
And that's economics right from the get-go,
yes,
as it were,
yes.
from your, so you were interested in economics.
Economics,
Big subject,
yes,
isn't it?
very
important, yeah.
Well, really, economics is enlightened common sense. I now teach economics for students on the University of Phoenix online.
Oh, yeah, that's
through the internet.
Yeah, online education is really important.
So, I mean, I present economics as really an enlightened understanding of what's around us, you know, how policies affect us, and so for people to really understand how economics can help them understand what's going on.
Yeah,
what policies are being made and how they're put together.
Did you study theoretical economics?
Well, you have to start off with principles of economics, understand the theory, but the introduction of econometrics, it was fairly new actually at the time.
He won the Nobel Prize for that, didn't he? I think Klein.
Klein did,
yes.
Yeah. And the point of it was that the econometrics...
Lawrence Klein, that's right. It was Lawrence. Nathan Klein was a psychologist.
Right. The focus of econometrics is to quantify many of the theories and ideas in economics and apply them to planning and forward-looking issues analysis. For example, when we look at the U.S. economy and see how we're going to grow, how we're going to handle the deficit, for example.
Not a small subject.
And what does it mean?
Yeah.
And how does inflation and unemployment, for example, interact with each other.
Yeah.
So we need to understand those, and that's what econometrics is all about.
Econometrics is a big term. Input-output theory and so forth. Is that Larry
Input-output was
Klein
another,
also?
well, Vasil Leontiev.
Vasily Leontiev at
Exactly.
Harvard.
Yes.
He was grand.
So he created this
Yeah.
input-output model,
Yeah.
which is another way of looking at the economy.
Yeah.
It's saying what's coming in, what's being produced.
Uh-huh.
So you look at the input-output matrix, which is a very interesting device.
Yeah, yeah.
Econometrics, however, goes into a lot of historical analysis. It
Yeah.
looks at the trends
Yeah.
and then look at all of the events that have taken place
Right.
and try to quantify those relationships.
Try to
and
qua-
try to
yeah.
isolate the impact of individual factors,
Uh-huh.
holding the others, holding them constant, if you
Yeah,
will.
right, right.
And then see if you were to change, for instance,
Yeah.
if we were to say military spending is going to be increased by $500 billion.
Yeah, that's right.
What would be the impact on the economy?
Yeah, what is the foot through,
Exactly.
the throw through, or
Exactly.
the flow
And
through, or something? yeah.
Precisely. Now, for
Yeah.
example, why aren't we creating jobs? So you
That's
need
a
to
very
understand.
interesting question now. Did you
Yeah.
see Krugman the other day? He
Yes,
had that thing.
I read Paul Krugman's
Yeah, did you
article.
see that thing he had the other day? It was his whole article was a graph.
Yes.
And it was the projection of the jobs.
Yes.
And he had it. Did you say, I happened to note that article.
Yeah.
It was interesting because instead of all these words, it was a graph. A
Graphs
lot
are-
can be contained in graphs. You know, a lot of
Absolutely.
information.
As a matter of fact, graphics are very effective in
Yeah.
communicating economic principles.
Uh-huh.
And I encourage my students to use graphs
Yeah.
in supply-demand analysis, in understanding how different factors come together. But
Well,
you have to begin to think graphically.
Yeah, I think so. They got this guy who does envisioning data. What's his Taft or Tuft or something? I want to get him. He's up in Rhode Island. He's got a book. He's got a thing with the March of Napoleon up to Moscow, and it's the size of the army that went, and it gets down like this, and then coming back from Moscow, it
I
goes
see.
down. It's very effective in
creates a
terms of
graphic,
just
yeah.
giving all at once a
Yeah,
gestalt.
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
I was in geography. I did a doctoral work in geography, and maps have a great
right.
deal of information.
Yeah.
But the economic theory is really important. There used to be a thing called political economy. People would compare politics.
Exactly.
And economics does inform the whole political process, don't you think?
Exactly. As a matter of fact,
Yeah.
you know, we now talk about the London School of Economics,
Yeah.
but the full name for the school is London School of Economics and Political Science.
It is, yeah.
Because
okay.
that is what you have to really mesh the two.
Yeah.
And sometimes, you know, we say, well, economics is more principles and theory, and politics is the art of doing things.
Yeah.
The art of what's possible. But we recognize that today, in making policy, leaders have to understand economics.
Yeah.
If they are not familiar with the underlying forces
Right.
that affect the economy,
Uh-huh.
they're likely to make mistakes. So, for example, right now we talk about the lack of jobs,
Yeah.
but people forget that we have increased our productivity
Uh-huh.
at such a high rate
All right.
that it makes it possible for firms to produce more with fewer people.
Well, that's something, if you don't mind, we could maybe talk about this a minute, and we got a lot to do with
Absolutely,
Islam,
so we can
absolutely.
come
But
back
this
to
is,
that topic.
since we have a thing that we're interested in, that Krugman thing, he had a thing where he said they were projecting the jobs, and I don't know, I mean, here, we can try and think of economics. You think we've got Adam Smith,
Yes.
1776, the same year as the steam engine was invented. And we have Ricardo, we have Marshall,
Yes.
we have, I don't know, Marx, Karl
Well, there's
Marx.
a whole, yeah.
There's a whole, and then we have, coming up to the mind, we have Schumpeter and Van Hayek.
Right.
We have Mundell with the supply side. We have
Yes.
Friedman in Chicago.
Of course,
We have a
right.
lot of different theoretical frames.
Friedman is now, of course, the leading supply
That's what
side
I
of it.
was going to ask you. You think he would be in with Mundell and that sort of thing
Yes.
in terms of informing the process that is representative or behind the thinking of, let's say, our current administration? With its tax cut and so forth.
yeah.
And I was going to ask you that with your understanding of things. What would you say if somebody were to say, do you remember Mr. Nixon in 1972, our president said, we're all Keynesians now?
Yes.
I forgot to put Keynes in there.
Right,
but
right.
Keynes was a big influence on
He
that.
was a
If we
proponent-
were to say the economic theory that underpins the operation of, let's just say, the American national economy, and let's say also this thing of globalization, where you have a that informs the political process. What would be the economic theory that would be informing the operation of the economy of this interrelated planet, spaceship Earth that we live on? Now, are we all Friedmanites now? Are we all Mundell? Are we supply side? What is it that is comparable to when Mr. Nixon said we're all Keynesians now?
Yeah.
What are we all now if we are anything?
I really think that
What do you
what
think?
we are dealing with now is a mix of supply-siders and classical economists. because, and you know, there have been, like Reagan was a strong supply sider, and Friedman, of course, was his advisor. And I think even this administration, to some extent, thinks that, you know, there's a trickle-down theory that if you make it possible for people to make money and create jobs, then the benefits of that will trickle down to the lower level in our society. But I think even this administration is taking proactive stands with respect to education, with respect to you know, other services that need to be provided, although they wouldn't go out and do as much as, say, the Democrats, you know, would want to do. So I think there's a balance one has to keep.
I think it's a balance.
And I think, you know, our economy is, you know, there's a whole issue of totally laissez-faire, just leave it alone, let it run by itself.
Is that where
that would be considered, you know, the typical, most conservative view of people who believe in, I guess a libertarian would say, leave it alone, have no intervention by the government. But I think it is important that we have some social responsibilities. So one can be conservative in terms of economic policy in general, but more liberal in terms of social policy.
And the liberal would involve bringing government function in and moderating the markets according to some sort of politically seen thing, drawing upon a democratic
For example,
thing.
in that case,
whereas the laissez-faire, there are some people, and we have these group called neocons now that seem to be influencing inordinately the current administration, and the hallmark of the national economic policy of our president, our current president, was a very huge tax cut to the already wealthy, which was seen, to get more income presumably into their hands so that they would expand their plant and equipment and create jobs. And now we have a thing where the jobs are not being created. And Mr. Keynes, were you familiar with Mr. Keynes? And he wrote that.
Yes, we studied.
The letter to his grandchildren in 1930. He wrote a letter to his grandchildren, rather famously. He said, "We are going. You, that is his grandchildren, that'd be about now, are going to be confronted with a phenomenon that's hard to see now. You're going to be confronted with a huge instance of technologically induced massive unemployment as the technology outruns the ability of labor to contribute in what has been a labor theory of value that's informed, some people would say, all economic theory. And that issue is not being addressed within the current policy discussion and consideration by the intellectual community? Or what about that question of technology supplanting labor as a source of production?
Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan has made that point repeatedly in terms of the huge influence of technology, the integration of technology into the processes of large corporations is now absolutely overwhelming. You see, General Electric, for example, now has every division, every one of its units doing business on the internet. They made it a mandate for people to do that. So every company is trying to take advantage of that. And the benefit of that is you have high productivity, and it also created a lot of capacity that hasn't been utilized. So the reason we are not able to really add a lot of jobs is that there is already so much capacity that hasn't been utilized.
That's right.
And the productivity is so high. Sometimes people, you know, I think, you know, take a short-sighted view of outsourcing. Now that's a subject by itself.
No, but it's worth talking. It's worth talking about because you've got a familiar. You've got familiar with that.
We need to understand that it is the American companies that benefit the most, and the shareholders of those companies, and consumers in the end paying lower prices.
Yeah, but this
for those goods that come into the United States.
Yeah, we were chatting here because you've got experience in Lahore, right in the heart of that area of what was the, you know, the subcontinent and so forth. And you've got this outside. Bangalore seems to be a center for it. They're outsourcing it. But you use the term productivity. That's usually associated with a ratio between labor's input to production. And now what we have is a situation, or some people are suggesting that Krugman chart does. So the outsourcing, we're going to put skills, even higher level skills maybe, mid-management, upper management into other places around the world to take advantage, Ricardo's comparative advantage or something. And but that it's now getting to be where the technology itself is going to become ever more productive, and they're not going to be able to create. That's what Mr. Keynes warned. They're not
Actually-
going to be able to create, and yet we distribute income to virtually everyone
Yeah.
by their having a job or a labor relationship to production,
That's
while
true.
the capital assets are very narrowly held all over the world.
It is
and is
true.
this a major problem that maybe is roiling the political question, and maybe is behind some of the, maybe at a certain level behind some of the counter-globalization efforts that we're beginning to find, and
There is-
maybe some of Stiglitz' work? And
I think there is a lot to be said about more equitable distribution of the ownership.
ownership
assets
as
that
opposed
produce.
to the opportunity to have a
Exactly.
job which might not be there.
Precisely. And the
Yeah.
point is that I think if you
Big
talk
question.
about productivity,
Yeah.
we generally think about it just labor productivity, productivity of output per man hour.
Yes, right.
But I spent almost 10 years working at AT&T.
You were chief
working-
financial officer.
Working on, well,
Yeah.
actually, before I became the
Yeah.
CFO,
Yeah.
I was in charge of measuring the productivity of the Bell system for the entire company. And we
Huge,
had a
yeah.
concept called total factor productivity, which
Okay.
is capital as well as labor
Mhm.
and materials and other things
Yeah.
that come in from the outside that you have to take into account.
Yeah.
So while we increase productivity,
Mhm.
yes, labor contributes to it,
Mhm.
but capital contributes a lot.
It does.
So because we are able to substitute for capital for labor,
Increasingly.
increasingly.
That's
that
beyond the problems
capital
of
labor ratio
that's
has risen.
coming. That's coming beyond the problems people now
That's
see
the
of
point.
outsourcing.
If you look at the capital
It's a
labor
bigger,
ratio,
more
the
dimension.
capital per head
Mm-hmm.
in U.S. industry
Yeah.
has risen tremendously, and I think that is what we are seeing the benefit of.
Okay.
And especially now with soft technology, with information technology,
Yeah.
computers, and so forth,
Yeah.
you are seeing a lot more benefit of that. And the long-term
Mm-hmm.
benefit is that we will experience higher standards of living as a result of that.
Well, let's hope we
But
can find a
there
pattern.
are always temporarily, there are always what we call structural unemployment.
Yeah.
When you're shifting your structure of the economy from, say, manufacturing to more of a service industry,
Yeah.
and now perhaps more
Or
into
from
an information.
agriculture to industrial. That
Exactly.
was a big thing.
Or
Everybody
from
went into the
agriculture to-
factory. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's on a world scale too.
And now
That's
we're
going
really
on.
looking,
If
even
we
going
think of a
beyond
system.
services, we
Yeah.
are going to information.
Yeah, right, right.
Because information is now driving
Yeah, right, right.
everything. So it is, I think in the long run, it is very beneficial, but the benefits will be distributed more equitably throughout, not only in this country, but throughout the world. I think if we could somehow reform our systems that give more people the opportunity to own capital.
Well, if they own
If they own means of production.
Well, if
that makes a difference.
If in the time of Tom Jefferson, in
Yes.
1776, the same year they wrote the Wealth of Nations,
right.
in that time, if you were to take on the one hand labor
Right.
and its input,
Right.
and then this might be applicable in a systems way to the world planet. We
Right.
have to be thinking
Yeah.
globally. The input to production was pretty much labor. I mean, a man would have a hammer,
But
and he would have take 12 hours to make a pair of
Exactly.
boots, or you had to all those trees. We had trees everywhere here, a huge forest,
And
all the
in
way
all of
from the
these
Atlantic
models-
to the
yeah.
to the Mississippi River, and they had to cut those trees down with a little axe they had.
Yes.
So the input of something other than labor to production was relatively small, but those things seem to be crossing in
But
the
that
modern
was- that
experience,
was
and
really-
we're still distributing income. The full employment, or the Employment Act of 1946 is still our basic policy grounding statement, that we're going to distribute income to people by their labor contribution, other than need, such in a socialist model or
Right,
something,
right.
a Marxian model, but according to their, and we do not relate them to the ownership of the capital instruments that are
And in fact,
actually
the-
responsible for production. There's a mismatch in
Yeah,
terms of the
that's
reality,
true, yeah.
no?
Incidentally.
Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, incidentally, since we
Big
started,
issue that isn't raised enough.
Absolutely.
Okay.
But since we began to talk about Islam,
Yeah. Yes.
this is one of the basic tenets. Property ownership.
It is.
Private ownership.
There's a respect for
is
private property in
absolutely-
Islam,
it
is
is
that? Let's
very
stress
important.
that. Yeah,
it's
right.
one of the basic principles
Uh-huh.
that people should have access to ownership of those means of production,
Yeah.
and then they can lift themselves up
Uh-huh.
through their own labor, through their hard work,
Yeah.
through learning new skills. They can produce more,
Mhm.
and that is one of the basic principles of, if you were to look at an Islamic
Yeah.
framework
Yeah.
of an economy.
Yeah, that's interesting. We want to talk about that. It's also, if you have in a modern economy, we begin to look ahead, if you have a viable holding of, let's say, ownership of some entity that, let's just say it's a robot system that turns out stuff,
Right.
and works, if you have a viable holding of ownership of that, that can be the source of an income flow.
Absolutely.
As it is to the stock
Yes.
owning class now.
Yeah.
But the stock owning class on a world scale is very small,
Yes.
plutocratic in virtually all the national economies
And this
around
is
the
where
world.
I think if there is to be, a general reform, that is where we need to pay attention. That
So it
find ways for people to own means of production, give them an opportunity. For example, in most of the countries, in my country where I was born,
In Pakistan.
in Pakistan,
Yes.
land reforms was always the major issue, that every time there was a change of government, everybody wanted to do land reforms because
Yeah.
people recognized
Yeah.
that the feudal families
Yeah.
basically controlled. I mean, there
Yeah.
was a time, as I'm sure you remember, during
Louis
the
the
first time,
16th. Remember France?
there were 22 families
Yeah.
that controlled almost 90% of the
In all of it was
in all of
particularly
Pakistan.
egregious in sin,
Yes.
wasn't it?
So
Yeah.
now I think people have tried to reduce the size of the holdings that anyone could hold. They have tried to make tenants owners eventually if they can
Of the land.
of the land.
Yeah, right.
And
Same-
I think that's basic. That's the
Yeah.
kind of thing that we need to do for people. But to me, I mean, when I now look back at Pakistan.
Yes,
and I
please,
go and
please.
visit and-
Yeah, we were talking. You
and-
came out of Pakistan in
and
21,
visit.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then now when I go back, I went back this time with my daughters.
Yes,
Who are, one of them is an attorney right here in Manhattan. She
Right.
lives and works here for a law firm. And my youngest one just graduated from NYU, so they came with me.
Congratulations
And
to her.
thank
yeah,
you.
yeah.
Thank you very much.
What
And,
what did she?
the youngest one just graduated last May in psychology.
In psychology.
Yes. In
so
fact,
the
I had asked
family's
her to
branching
come
out.
and visit
huh?
with us today
Yeah.
if she wanted to. but
Oh,
she was
by all
busy.
means, I'd love to meet. Maybe
Yeah.
we can meet on
She's
another
interested
occasion.
in the media
Okay, yeah.
and some art direction and so
Yeah, well, maybe on another occasion we
Yes,
can get together.
absolutely.
You'd like that, yeah.
So anyhow, I came out of Pakistan and
Yeah.
then
London,
went to
London School.
And then one summer, there was an opportunity to work in the U.S. for 3 months as a part of an exchange program.
Yes,
So I got a job with AT&T.
You're still a young man.
Then
yeah.
at the time, it was New England Telephone and Telegraph
Yeah.
in Boston. So we were housed at MIT, the whole group of about 40 students that came from all over the world.
All over the world.
That was the
right.
center. And then we worked in different places in the Boston area. And at that point, I wrote back to one of my professors, Professor Phillips, who, by the way, is the author of the Phillips curve.
Oh, really?
In
He's
economic theory.
Oh, I wondered sometimes.
Almarin
Who
Phillips
did
was
that
my
Phillips
advisor.
curve?
He
Yeah.
was my professor
Yeah.
at the London School of
No
Economics.
kidding. Right. Okay.
So I asked him, and his advice was that I should stay and do my PhD here.
Yeah.
And so I decided, and I went to Tufts, and I got my PhD. And at the same time, AT&T extended the offer, and it became a permanent job. So I stayed with them for 30 years.
Yes, you were 30 years. You became chief financial
Then
officer.
I became a chief financial officer.
Not a
of the
small
business.
matter.
No,
That's
it's
a
not.
huge
Yeah, it was
responsibility to
quite a-
understand that. You do. Who was your advisor on the PhD, if I may? I mean, and what did you do your dissertation
Professor
on?
Holtzman was my advisor.
And what were you
He-
doing your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on the economics of competition in the telecommunication industry.
Not a small
Because I was
matter.
working for AT&T. Now, this is, remember,
Yes,
DeButts was the chairman of
Yeah.
AT&T.
Yeah. Who was?
DeButts.
DeButts
John
at that time, John DeButts
John
was,
DeButts
yeah.
was the chair.
Yeah.
And I had just joined AT&T at the end of 1968. And in 69, I had finished my coursework at Tufts.
Yeah.
So now it was a matter of selecting a topic for dissertation.
Yes, right.
So I went
You
to
were
my
a candidate.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I went to my supervisors and I mentioned this to them because I could see at that point, by the way, MCI had just started. In 69, they
That
had
was,
got the...
McGowan.
In McGowan, exactly.
Yeah.
They had just basically connected with St. Louis and Chicago.
I did a program with
begin-
Mr. McGowan the day it was
yeah, I saw
announced
his
by
name on the
the
list.
day it was announced that the MCI thing had gone in his favor. That
Oh,
just
really?
that just was a lead into the whole breakup of the AT&T. I think.
Yeah,
don't
I
you?
know, right, exactly.
Yeah. Anyway, go ahead.
So, but in any case, to cut the long story short, my topic was, so I was interested in looking at that. There was another company called Daytran. They were focused on data transmission. MCI was doing voice. And my thought was that looking ahead, there was going to be obviously competition and we could no longer maintain the monopoly.
Yeah.
But the mentality at the time within AT&T was, no, you couldn't even talk about competition.
Right.
But
Well,
fortunately...
AT&T had worked so well
Yeah,
in
I
many
know. Well,
people's
this is the thing,
minds. It
we
was a
used to-
great corporation,
Yeah,
you know.
there's no question. I mean,
Yeah.
at one time, it
Yeah.
was the biggest corporation on earth.
And they did a darn
And
good job,
We employed...
by and
at
large.
one
Service,
point-
yeah.
We at
Yeah.
one point, AT&T employed 1.3 million people.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so it
They
was
had that
really-
Bell Labs in the 60s.
Bell Labs
It was
was really a
wondrous.
jewel.
A lot
Yes.
of transistor research came out of
Exactly.
there and other things, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
there was like a patent a day. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, a patent a day. A patent a day keeps the blues away. Huh?
Right,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, yeah.
But anyhow, coming
Yeah.
back to that, so I was, very interested in competition, so I did my dissertation on that topic. And since then, actually, there's been a lot of analysis. A lot
Yeah,
of
I
other
should
people,
think, yeah.
consulting firms, have written on the same topic.
Uh-huh.
And the whole idea of that was to show that there are certain benefits of monopoly, but there is much greater benefit in terms of competition.
Big subject, good big
By
subject for you to
lowering
have, and some of these things will translate over into thinking in broad terms of the world economy
Sure.
and so forth. And we want to now tell us if you can. Now you're Muslim, you're out of the Center for Center for Understanding Islam. When it got started, what's it charges, and let's begin to talk and put some of these issues we've been talking about maybe into the realm in terms of trying to understand Islam and its place in the world and the world in relationship to Islam.
Yes, sure. Center for Understanding Islam was created almost immediately after 9/11. Several of us living in the northern New Jersey area, New York, felt that we needed to come together and really understand, first of all, ourselves, how to present Islam to others who don't understand it. And obviously people were asking questions, and the issue was, how do we do that?
Yeah.
So we felt that we needed to bring together a group of scholars who would do a thorough job of understanding what the basic principles are and address some of the current issues.
Yeah.
So we, in fact, created a booklet
Yeah.
in effort to try to answer some of the questions. So this booklet is called Islam, Short Answers to Current Key Questions.
Okay.
And in it, we picked up issues like loyalty of Muslims to America. People would question, for example, what does it mean? Does it, the question is, are you a Muslim first or are you an American first?
Yeah, you get that with, remember John Kennedy ran for president?
Exactly.
They say, are you a Catholic and will
Exactly,
you
right.
be doing what the Pope says or not? Or
Yes. So in
some
this,
people associate that with Israel. Jewish people are connected to Israel.
there are a lot of issues.
Yeah.
So, for example, loyalty was one of them. Then gender equity. How does Islam treat women with respect to men? Democracy in Islam. Concepts of jihad. What does jihad mean?
Yeah.
We also talked about the fundamentalism, extremism, terrorism. These issues and where do they come from?
Yeah.
Relations with non-Muslims.
Yeah.
What does the Quran have to say?
Right.
And what do our traditions have to say
Major
about
questions, yeah.
that? And then, of course, our goal was to try to present these ideas and the teachings of Islam in a way that we could really demonstrate that what classical Islam teaches, the faith itself, is consistent with what the thinking of the forefathers of this country were when they formulated the Constitution. And actually, Robert Crane has written a lot about that.
Brilliantly.
And there is an article in this booklet that talks about towards a common vision for America. And that is to try to understand our common heritage, common understanding of universal values, and what Islam has to contribute to that. And so that was the focus of the Center for Understanding Islam. So we have provided speakers to audience. We've gone to churches, to synagogues. I have spoken at libraries, at colleges, at Rotary Club, and so forth.
Good, yeah.
I'm speaking next week, actually 2 weeks from now, I'm speaking at the Valley Forge Military Academy.
Okay,
as their keynote speaker.
Yeah, okay.
Because there is so much thirst for knowledge.
Oh,
People are
there
trying to
is
understand.
now. Yeah, there is now because it's a source
So and we all came out and condemned what happened in 9/11. It was a horrendous.
Everyone at the
act of evil.
Center for Understanding Islam.
We have a standard statement on our website. We have explicitly condemned and shown that, first of all, I think we need to make sure that people understand what Islam teaches versus what some Muslims may do. And it's very, very important because people sometimes confuse that.
Yes.
They see the action of some people who call themselves Muslims, and therefore they run to the conclusion that that is what Islam must teach.
We have Mr. Huntington saying we may have a clash of civilizations.
And he has talked about a clash of civilizations.
He's an important scholarly
he
person.
is, absolutely, but I think that theory...
And what do you think of that?
Well, Let me share this with you. Robert Great actually has done some work on it, and he's giving a talk on Sunday at Princeton on this topic of from clash of civilizations to a dialogue of civilizations. And that is, if we really understand
big difference
what each civilization has done and contributed. And actually, this is one of the ironies, frankly, among the intellectual community. They just outright deny the contributions of Islam and Muslims to this civilization. A lot of things that Europe
we wouldn't have
discovered
gotten,
wouldn't have come if it had
well,
not
it
been
was
for
a
the
bridge over from the classical period to the modern. And where would we be without algebra, I'd like to know. Or the zero. Didn't we get the zero from the Muslim world?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The word algebra.
Yeah, algebra.
You see, it comes from, from Arabic.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
The whole notion.
It was
astronomy.
Yeah.
Navigators. And in fact, there is documentation that Columbus, when he traveled, his navigators were Muslim.
Is that a fact?
Yes.
Is that a fact, or is that the thought?
No, this has been documented. There are documents that people have have produced on history of Muslims in America.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have actually come up. They're trying to now document and sort of objectively show.
Yeah. Well, it was 1453 that Istanbul was overrun by the Ottomans, was it? And it blocked the eastward mole.
Right.
So he had to start going west.
So my point, without getting into history, I think today in America there are about 7 million Muslims.
Okay, yeah, let's get some
from all
demographics.
Different backgrounds.
Yeah.
We need to understand who are the Muslims. We are not a monolith, one single community. There's a tremendous amount of diversity within Islam, within the Muslim community. When people look at Arabs and Muslims, people tend to equate Arab with Muslims.
Arabs about 20% of the
about
Muslim?
20 to 23%. There are different studies people have come up with. About 23% of the American Muslims are Arab. Worldwide.
Oh, what, 20%? Oh, on the world scale also?
Oh, no, worldwide it's about 15.
15% of the, because people tend to associate that with, with Arab.
Yeah, because when you look at Indonesia as the largest Muslim country.
Yeah, 100 million people.
India has the second largest Muslim population.
Right.
And then Pakistan and Bangladesh and so forth.
Right.
So Arabs are very important. Obviously, Islam began in Saudi Arabia. But Arabs do not dominate that. So we need to understand.
Most of the Arabs that do exist live in Africa, actually. If you start thinking Egypt and, that is actually in Africa.
Another point that people need to understand is that even among the Arabs, there are Christians. Not all Arabs are Muslims. Yes, Coptic Christians in Egypt, they're a very large sect. And certainly
there's a large number in Lebanon. There's a large number.
Exactly. I mean, the Lebanese government, if you look at it, is Christians.
Yes, right.
That are in control. So people sometimes tend to equate Arab and Islam and Arabs and Muslims. So I think hopefully people would understand to look a little deeper. Another aspect that we need to emphasize is that every country has its own culture.
Yes.
Just like the U.S. has a culture. It's a mixture of many, many different cultures.
This is a big mix-up over here.
Yes, but when you go to different countries, Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Libya, all of these countries, they all have their local customs.
Thank goodness.
Okay?
Thank goodness.
And that's what the diversity, that's the beauty of the God's design that God created. In fact, God tells us in the Quran that we made you into tribes and nations so you may recognize each other.
Do you think
that you despise each other?
Do you think we're all going to end up eating at McDonald's, the whole world?
Oh, I hope not.
Do you think everybody's going to end up speaking English? Do you see that 100 years out?
Oh,
is
I
it
think
all
English
going to
is
be
a wonderful language. I think English is a means of. I mean, it's a beautiful language. It's flexible. It's easy to learn. Honestly, I mean, I learned English. When I was in elementary school.
It's practical to know English.
It's very practical. You need to understand.
It's the language of the internet.
Absolutely. But that does not mean that you give up your values just because you speak English.
Do you think people are afraid that they are going to be swallowed up in an assimilation model where it's all going to become one thing, sort of like a Hollywood representation of the world, and the cultural values are going to be lost? And this is one of the reasons why there are people who feel threatened by modernization, which seems to be a trend that is not one that's amenable to reserving or preserving cultural diversity and so forth.
That kind of argument is used by radio talk show hosts and others to say, they hate us because they don't like our values.
Oh, well, wait, they go further because they don't like our they don't like freedom. They don't like they don't like truth, and they don't like justice of the American way.
That
yeah,
wouldn't be
that
far
kind.
from the truth.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
If you talk
well, we
to-
want to understand that. Yeah.
Okay, there are, because within each country, if you are looking at Muslim countries,
Yeah.
there is obviously going to be a difference of opinion, and it would vary depending upon the level of education people
Yeah.
have.
Okay, that's important.
Okay,
Yeah, that's
So
important.
the
Demographic.
educated elite in most of these countries have no such concern about being dominated by other
You think
by
not?
other cultures.
You
No.
think not?
They are concerned about, for example, some of the social customs and McDonald's and Kentucky Fried Chicken everywhere. I mean, you go to Lahore.
Yeah, they
now
got
the most
McDonald's
popular
now?
most popular places to eat are McDonald's and Kentucky Fried
Is
Chicken.
that true?
Yes, and they actually have.
Dear me.
They have adopted.
Yes. With all that
dishes
tandoor
from-
and whatnot, they go from
They
McDonald's.
have actually adapted
What
their
does that
menus
tell us? Yeah.
to Pakistani meals.
Yeah,
And
really?
although, of course, McDonald's is the same, but they offer other things that would, and the Chinese is also quite popular.
And
But my
the
point is-
culture is all one way.
my
The
point is-
movies and the popular music and
Precisely.
everything.
And-
It's cultural imperialism
Exactly.
in a sense,
So some
right?
of that clearly affects it,
Yeah.
and I think people who are very conservative, religious communities, feel that this is kind of, corrupting.
Yeah.
The
I don't think
culture.
anyone
But I
wants
don't-
to be occupied, do
Yeah.
they, by another culture
No.
other than their own that is not respected?
The
Look at what
point
we
is
did to
should
American
develop a
Indian
mutual
cultures.
respect for
yeah.
all cultures.
But we don't. And we
Okay.
have a geopolitical war where the powerful tend to lord it over the weak
Well,
and subsume them, don't
Yeah.
we?
So I think one of the
Yeah.
things we have to do, to try to do, is to respect each other's cultures,
Mm-hmm.
because the universal truths are the same. Universal values that we all believe in are the same. Teachings of the Quran, teachings of Islam, are, as we say, and I think Dr. Crane has done it in his articles,
Yeah.
show that there is no conflict in terms of what it means to be a true loyal American and to be a true loyal Muslim. I'm an American.
Yeah.
I am proud to be an American,
Yeah.
and I'm proud to be a Muslim.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of my faith
Yeah.
because that's how I believe, and I'm able to talk to people
Do you
about.
think the we try to get universal truth. We had the out of the French Revolution, the rights of man, and then we've had we had this thing, Eleanor. We had the Universal Declaration of
Right.
Human Rights. Do you think the people, if they were, let's just say, some sort of an Al Qaeda person or something like that, they were sitting around talking or something, or somebody else, that they would find that we have certain principles that they would find agreement on,
Well,
even though they're across barriers from each other
Well,
and
first of all, I would
barricades as well.
say that neither bin Laden nor Al Qaeda represent Islam or Muslims in any way.
They don't represent. They must
do
represent.
not represent Islam. They represent their own political agenda that they are trying to advance. And there are people.
But they will invoke Islam.
They invoke Islam,
Yeah.
but they invoke it in a twisted manner, which is not the teaching, which is not consistent with the teaching of Islam.
They think it is.
They think it is,
Yeah.
and they would use those passages and in fact,
Selectively.
selectively
Yeah.
and say that justifies their behavior.
Yeah.
But there are hundreds of other verses in the Quran that would basically they would be contradicting when they take that action. So first and foremost, as a matter of fact, if you go to our website,
I've been there. It's a great website.
CUII.org, there's a letter.
CUII.org.
Yes.
Right. Okay. It's a good site. Yeah.
And there is a memo, there's a letter by a professor from Adrian College about a memo to bin Laden.
Yes.
Say, go to hell. Why? Because we say he does not represent Muslims anywhere in the world. He represents his own agenda that he has formulated, and there are people who are naive enough to follow him and commit these horrendous acts anywhere in the world. Nowhere in the Quran does it justify, does it even condone killing of others.
How do
this
we
comes sort of brings me to jihad, for example.
All right. Go
You
ahead.
know,
Yeah.
because that question
Jihad.
comes up that Muslims are involved in jihad, and that means to kill all the infidels and so forth. That to me is such an oversimplification and misstatement of what
I
Quran
think of it as a
teaches.
spiritual quest for
Precisely. Jihad,
enlightenment.
in
Yeah.
essence,
Yeah.
is a struggle,
Yeah.
a self-struggle, a spiritual quest to understand
Oneself.
the message of God, understanding how to relate to that the message and how to submit to the will of God, and live your life according to those values.
Islam means submit.
Islam
doesn't it?
means submission
Yeah.
to the will of God.
Right, okay.
So
yeah.
a Muslim,
Like the first step of the 12-step program.
yeah, so a Muslim is someone who submits to the will of God, and that's what all the word Muslim means. And so jihad, as its essence, is self-struggle. There is a second meaning of jihad and a third one. The second meaning is that if you are oppressed and if you're attacked, you have the right and even the obligation then to defend yourself.
Is that something along with the idea of just war?
And that is, yes, exactly. And that is
In
when
Western,
you can pick,
yeah.
then that's when you can take up arms. And the instances that are...
In fact, you have an obligation to, perhaps?
You have an
in that-
obligation when there's oppression, you have an obligation to do that.
Then there's a question of, are we being
If you,
oppressed?
for example, the Quran specifically says, if you're being oppressed, if you're being turned out of your homes, as was happening to Muslims, that you have the right to do that.
And does that also carry an obligation for people to recognize that if people are being oppressed, that is in the name of some universal principle a wrong thing, and one supports the oppressed by the oppressors in a general moral sense?
But when you think about this,
You
in fact,
understand what I'm saying?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think
Not just yourself, I
human
mean.
rights are fundamental to the teaching of Islam.
Yeah.
And Crane would, Bob Crane would say that Muslims invented human rights. If you look at the treatment of the basic principles of respect for life, respect for property, respect for the community, the requirement for consultation, what's basically the idea that you have to get consensus within the community and then respect that.
Is that an admonishment? And it's in Islam, right?
That's
And
Islamic
they
teaching.
respect the idea of private property.
Private property,
You can't
absolutely.
seize it without, so there's a basis of
Exactly.
law.
Yes, and
And-
in fact, in the Quran, there is there's a specific instructions: do not short change people in weight. So if you are a merchant and you're selling some goods, you must give them goods worth $1. If the dollar,
Yeah.
is the price that somebody's paying,
Isn't there?
you must do that.
Yeah, isn't there also a thing about usury, and that there is a very much of a thing
Usury is
against
prohibited, yes.
the idea of there's conflict possibly in the sense of I did a program with one of the sons of Prince Faisal one time, and Prince Mohammed saw it, and against the use of interest in business relationships that become usurious. If they were to look at the people in America caught up with credit card debts of 20% and so forth, they would see this as something that's against the will of the order.
And that is what Islam forbids. You
And
see,
is that a major break point between them? And the West has somehow gotten around that because it's so convenient to the way we do
That's right.
business.
They may be
Maybe it
convenient.
goes back to the grounding policies of economic theory
Exactly.
that we're arguing about things that are of importance in terms of justice.
And it is true. I think credit is important in the expansion of an economy. You make funds available. People should be able to raise capital and make it, convenient for people to, carry out transactions.
Yes.
But I think when it reaches the level of usury, now you are depriving people of all of the assets that they would have. You're basically eating into everything that they would. They become slaves. In a
So
sense.
they would prefer, if it were possible, I'm wondering if
Yeah.
you could, because you're both an economist and an Islamic scholar, if it were possible to have a system of monetary system, or a system where you could have capital formation with equity, distributed
Yes.
equity and ownership in a way that could avoid interest?
That's
Would
what
that be
Islam
something
teaches.
that Islam would teach?
That is
And yet
absolutely.
in the world you cannot work that kind of a way with the World Bank and International
There are
Monetary
attempts, by the way.
structural adjustments and notions of economic theory from modern economic
There are
theory
attempts
that
to do
impinges upon that deep-held sense of the relationship, business relationships that should exist in
It
the
is
world.
true.
And is that a major problem at a practical level?
It is a major problem at a practical level in the sense that we now see how volatile our financial systems are.
Amen.
And you see
Yeah.
how sensitive they are to some event that takes place and everything collapses.
Yeah.
That's why we have to be very careful that the mechanisms that we have should be such that they can absorb the shocks. And if there is more equity involvement, more people are owners of capital as a part of the process, you would have a lot more shock absorption.
Yeah, I see that. Joseph Stiglitz or even Oliver, not Oliver, what's his name, Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs and people at Columbia and so on, they will say, and they will sort of give some support to these guys who stop things at Seattle. We have the International Monetary Fund, we have the World Bank, we have the World Trade Organization, we have NAFTA, we have globalization and all this kind of thing.
Yes.
And there are people, legitimate scholars who are economists, who will say that the system that's in place, that is the legitimate system that is supposedly in place, that they will assert is the basis of their legitimacy and so forth, is one that will and can only serve. They don't accept the notion of trickle down. It will serve the upper 10 to 20% of the world population, but it's going backward in terms of 60 to 80% of the world population, so that the system that's in place is not adequate to what the future requires. There's something new needed.
Right.
Do you agree with that,
I
or
agree.
what you do?
It's
so
not
that the
opening
system
the
that we're
doors.
trying to put onto the world with structural adjustment, nation after nation has been ruined in the name of a legitimate notion of economic theory that is, if we're trying to impose that upon the world, there's a serious problem that is going to get blowback, as they say.
There is.
And maybe some of what's happening now in the world is a result of this mismatch between that theoretical assumptions that allow the legitimate powers to try and do that, and the people who are reacting out of an existential sense of threat to their own situation.
Anytime you impose a system that doesn't take into account the indigenous realities of how the economy works, IMF has failed in many instances where they have gone in and to the countries and say, unless you institute
structurally adjust,
raise prices. For example, I remember
give your money to the already rich.
Double the electricity rates, for example. In one case, because they say you must raise enough money. Well, what that meant was that farmers couldn't farm anymore. It was too expensive. They had to shut down their tube wells.
But these people have an economic model that's supposed to work, and it doesn't.
But they're looking at economic model that works in the United States, that works in a highly automated economy where you assume that the infrastructure is in place. But when you go into a country where there's no infrastructure to begin with, you don't have roads, you don't have available electricity everywhere, you don't have alternative fuels that people can use, and you now come and take the only source of energy they have, and you double its prices. What are
and then maybe sell it off to a rich plutocrat.
This is the problem.
Because we have problem plutocrats in the leadership class all over the world. There's a small group that runs things, and we do not have economic democracy anywhere.
In addition to plutocrats, I feel the biggest problem is corruption.
All right.
And institutionalized corruption in many of the less developed countries is a huge drain on the economy because of all the aid that goes in, or even the indigenous resources that the country has, were fully invested in the economy as a whole for the benefit of everybody. We wouldn't have the poverty that we observe. If we observe it because, for example, the former Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto, her husband, was known as Mr. 10%.
Yeah, Mr. 10%.
Because it was known, and he took 10% of
well, we have here in the United States, we have our Enron, don't we? And we have Mr. Kenneth Lay still walking around happy as a lark.
Exactly.
And is that just an aberration, or is there not maybe, they used to have a saying, there's something rotten in Denmark? There may be something rotten at the core of what the Western world is trying to impose upon the world, and the legitimate reaction to that should be understood in those terms.
Well, first of all, I would say that
you understand what I'm saying?
I do.
That we don't have a model that's worthy of that we haven't got our act together intellectually or in terms of our models.
And I would say that on the whole, capitalism really does work.
Okay.
But if you go to extremes, I mean, there's a concentration of wealth, concentration of control over means of production, then
and ownership of it.
And ownership of it.
Yeah, which is the case all over the world.
Which is the case, and that's where
including the United States.
And the reason, for example, even you look at Iraq. I mean, one of the things we discovered is that so much of the money that Iraq was getting, oil for food program, was going into bank accounts of Saddam Hussein.
Well, it goes on all over the world.
Or others. So I think that is the institutionalized corruption really is one of the biggest evils that we need to eradicate.
But it might not be only their corruption; it might be also ours. And the fact that we may the reality has changed with this technological development. So, and we haven't gotten a system that's in keeping with that. one other thing, I wonder, if you're talking about people who do violence, terrorism or
Right.
something, I'm not sure what that definition is. And how do we deal with the concept of state terrorism, and how do we differentiate, in Islam perhaps?
Right, yeah.
I would have asked you whether there's been something like a Protestant Reformation as far as dealing with new secular realities, but more to the point of justice in the sense of when a state will operate what they call a war against another, and that state is powerful and is occupying. And I have particular reference to the United States of America, where we went in 1960s into Vietnam, and I still remember very well, we went and we were responsible with, do you remember napalm?
Yes.
And the napalm would be
bombs,
dropped upon women and children and burned, and we destroyed and killed something on the order of 4 million human beings.
Yes.
We lost 58,000 of our own people. We 4 million were destroyed. Cambodians, Vietnamese. We did that, and in the end, Mr. McNamara says, well, we made a mistake.
Yes.
And there's no answering
There's no answer.
for the evils, if that's the right term, that is done by the strong against the weak. But if the weak do something to try and resist that,
characterized as
then
terrorism.
it's called terrorist. Now,
Right.
George
Yeah.
III called George Washington a terrorist. They called Nelson Mandela a terrorist. What about that issue, that terrorism is just reserved for the violence that is done by the weak against the strong, and the strong never are put in the dock?
Well, that's the unfair part of this debate.
And is that a problem in terms of
It is a real problem because people feel
blowback?
that you do have this tendency for people to call everyone a terrorist if they don't agree with you.
Yeah.
And people don't want to listen to the reasons why they may do some of the things. By the way, I want to make a basic point.
Yeah, we've got about 10 minutes, about
We were
8
talking
minutes
about-
left, so
we were
let's
talking
get it
about
in.
jihad, for example.
Yes,
and I mentioned
please.
2 forms of jihad.
Yeah, right.
The first being the self-struggle, the second being the right to take up arms if you're being oppressed. But the third one is the intellectual jihad. And it goes back to your question in terms of Reformation. That is continuing effort by scholars to understand the Word of God, the teachings of the Prophet, the examples of his life, to see how that can be applied to our lives today.
Within an evolving ontology.
Now, for the last 600 years or so, the effort has not been, people have not focused on that. But I think there is much more of an effort, there is a revival of that effort. And there are people here in the United States,
Islamic
I believe,
scholars.
Islamic scholars
Yeah,
who are
right.
in the best position to do that.
Yeah.
And one of the things I want to point out about
Yes,
this
please.
whole issue of terrorism,
Yeah.
to try to put it in context, look at the history of the world.
Yeah.
From the time of the Prophet, we'll go back to a time of, a time immemorial.
Well, we can go back
The
200,000 years now. We've
conflicts
been
that we've
around.
had,
Yeah.
conflicts that we've had, where did terrorism originate? Muslims were not the originators of this. Muslims did not originate suicide bombing, for example. They now use it in some cases,
Yeah.
and I have personally condemned that, because I think that is absolutely taking of innocent lives is forbidden in
As it
Islam.
was in Vietnam?
Yeah, absolutely.
And they get away with it without
people do it
was
again.
anybody put in jail for what we
Well,
did
same
in
thing with
Vietnam?
what has
Was
happened-
anybody put
what
in jail
happens to
and
the
made to serve time?
Palestinians?
Yeah.
when,
Okay.
when they,
Yeah.
so my
That's what I'm
question
saying,
is,
yeah.
some of these issues that we now raise, oh, these people are bombing, or these people are terrorists. As I said, first of all, I condemn those activities because I believe there should be peaceful protests, peaceful way of resolving these issues.
Yeah.
However, then if you retaliate with helicopter gunships,
Yeah.
and you destroy people's homes, the reaction is a desperate response to saying, I have nothing else to lose.
What's to lose? It's
And why-
existential.
that is what-
yeah.
So I think we
Yeah.
fail to listen to the reasons why people may be doing certain things, and just simply blame it on Islam. It
Yeah.
is absolutely not the
Just
case.
saying-
Look at the conditions of those people that
Yeah.
we put them in,
Yeah.
and if they react to that, that's what we are seeing. So that's why I'm saying, if you go back to the history
Yeah,
of
right.
Islam, right, 1425 years, right, since the migration of the Prophet
Yeah.
to Medina.
Yeah.
When did this terrorism begin? It began when you saw instances of injustice, when you have situation where people are being occupied and deprived and are being oppressed.
Yeah.
And those people are rising up against the oppressors. And in that case, we now have to recognize that, yeah, it is the grievances of those people, and they choose to use their way of rallying support for their cause and do what they do, but don't blame the faith. Because Islam has never taught. Anyway, even when people say, they use the citation that Muslims are supposed to kill infidels wherever you find them. There are references in the Quran that they talk about. And that goes to a specific instance when Muslims, when they had established themselves in Medina,
Yeah.
they were being oppressed. They were turned out of their homes in
Yeah.
Mecca.
Right.
They had to migrate to Medina.
So it was a
It
responsibility
was a responsibility to defend themselves.
Yeah. Right.
And that is why those things occurred. And in fact, those verses that came were relevant specifically to those kinds of events. There is another aspect of that history that people forget.
Yeah.
The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had treaties
Mm-hmm.
with Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Jews were the dominant
Well, they were
community
of
in
the
Medina.
book. They're all of the book, and
Right?
they accept all
People
the
of the
Judaism.
book, absolutely.
Yeah.
And he had treaties. He would send emissaries to kings of Abyssinia.
Yeah.
King of Abyssinia gave refuge to Muslims when they were being pushed out of their homes.
Yeah.
The Prophet sent a group there. So the point of it was, for anybody to say that Muslims cannot have Jews or Christians as their friends makes no sense.
They've had friends over
Because
the
the Prophet had friends.
Yeah.
The Prophet
Right.
worked with them. They had treaties.
Yeah.
And sometimes they cite the example that Muslims were killing Jews. Well, it turns out that there was a treaty that the Prophet had with the Jewish community in Medina, and when that treaty was broken, then there was a question of the punishment, and the Prophet called the rabbi and said, according to your law,
On the one hand,
what is the
and then
punishment?
and then they could come
And
to
it was a rabbi who gave the punishment that was carried out. It wasn't the Prophet.
Yeah, right.
So I think people need to understand the context a little more.
Yeah, I think it is
And I just hope
extremely
that-
important. Yeah.
And I really just hope that people in the media, radio talk show hosts, television, evangelists,
Cable
and others,
television interview
cable television
programs
interview
like
people.
this one.
Yes.
Yes, we'll try to understand. Enlighten us. Yes,
Absolutely.
yes,
So
yeah.
the idea to be intellectually honest
Yeah.
and look at the history.
Well, I think so.
Look at the teachings of the faith.
Right.
And then look at behavior. Now, I condemn the behavior of people who are using Islam.
Yeah.
And they've basically hijacked our faith.
Well, then I
and
could
our job
condemn.
is to get it back.
And I could try and condemn the behavior of the United States of America that is short-sighted, perhaps, in not being sensitive to the cultural diversities that do exist. And so one wants to be able to be free to criticize in a friendly way your own system, of which people have a hard time, I think, being empathetically able to put themselves in the position of the other person.
Yes.
Do you
Right.
think?
Yes,
And it is particularly difficult if one feels that to put yourself in the position of the enemy is really particularly difficult,
Yes,
And yet
yes.
that's part of a struggle of trying to understand it so you can get at a comprehensive understanding of what's going on and maybe
Exactly.
lead to some sort of
And I think the
conflict resolution.
challenge for American Muslims
Yeah.
is to make sure to go out, work with communities, work with all of communities, go out and work in social service groups,
Yeah.
Be visible, and then show what a good Muslim is.
And go on cable talk.
Absolutely.
Go on
available.
cable public access to discussion shows to
And be a living
share
example,
these things.
and you can be an ambassador of Islam, an ambassador of your culture, by doing that, by setting up a good example.
That's you, sir. Sorry, we've run out of time.
That's
It's been
all
your
right. Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you really very much for coming in. And one and all is recommended to go to the site cuii.org.
Thank you for
Center
having me.
for Understanding Islam Incorporated. Lots of interesting stuff you can find there. We in Conversations invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. But Muhammad Ali Chaudry, thank you, Dr. Muhammad Ali Chaudry. Thank you very much for coming in and sharing your own background, economic and otherwise, and about Islam. Appreciate it very much. And we invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's it for this particular program. But one more time, Dr. Chaudry, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for having me.
Great pleasure.
My pleasure to be here.
So we just got started, scratched the surface of a huge subject. We have to stay in touch.
I think it's a
with
wonderful opportunity.
We
I'm
have to
glad
stay in touch
continue
with one
this.
another, and you have to help trying to put me in touch with some people that are really, good voices in terms of helping to share.
As
these
I
things.
mentioned, the Center for Understanding Islam is initiating this series
Yeah.
of talks, which
Good.
will be in-depth for people who really want to think through the issues rather
Yeah.
than jump on sound bites
Yeah.
and really try to understand.
That's what we want to try and do here. Like I think it's the Vedics have been telling us for a long time that it's all a seamless web. All these disciplines we develop, specialization we divide it into, it's all one interconnected system.
Yes.
And so they interrelate. The economics relates to so there wants to be